Good evening, everybody. I didn't dance. I was tempted to don my outfit and do a bit of river dance for you. But what a way to start. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm not Kerry Thomas, I'm Liz Mosley. Unfortunately, Kerry isn't able to be here to edit this conversation this evening. He very much would like to be, I know, but I'm happy to step in for him, and thank you for joining us. We've got a few invited experts who really know their way around the world of rivers and water safety and water pollution and so on. So I will be leaning on them for their insight and expertise. What we try and do in Think-ins is to look for stories. And what we could see in the slides that you saw at the beginning there is that all is not well with English rivers, with British rivers even. And we've run a couple of pieces in Tortoise recently, one written by my colleague Ellen Halliday about the River Lee, and another one written by Simon Barnes, who is with us this evening, about the return of otters to some rivers. And they've captured members' imaginations, in particular, these pieces, because rivers strangely mean something to everybody. One way or another, we have a very sort of emotional connection to rivers. I grew up in a village in West Yorkshire called Burley and Wharfdale. And the River Wharfe was a really big part of my childhood. I almost didn't notice it being, but we would go and we would be on there are pebbly beaches, and we would paddle and we would swim. And at one stage, just a bit down from the footbridge, there was an incredibly dangerous but unbelievably good fun rope swing that somebody had attached to a tree that we would swing out and plunge into the water. Really don't advise it. But it was a very big part of my childhood, and there's been a huge campaign, and we're joined by Karen Shackleton this evening, who's a founder member of the Ilkley Clean River Group, to make that water safe to do that stuff in. Because probably when I was doing it when I was little, it probably wasn't safe, but we just maybe didn't realise it. So I'm going to come to Karen shortly to sort of talk to her about her campaign, about what she's achieved so far, about what it means. But I'm going to start off trying to tackle the exam question this evening, which is who can save Britain's rivers, with Simon Barnes, who is, I know many of you will know, a very well-known and well-respected author and journalist, understands the natural world, rivers, biodiversity, wildlife, all of that good stuff. Good evening, Simon. Thanks so much for being here. Nice to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Simon, why do rivers, I've explained a little bit about why rivers, or that particular river, matters to me personally, but why are rivers important in general to all of us? What do rivers do really that we should be caring about?
Absolutely. Well, they're not really important, rivers, I suppose, any more than blood is important to a human body. Waters flow through our land just as the blood flows through us. And if we fill these circulatory systems up with crap, then the system is going to suffer as a result. If we make it flow too fast or too slow, if we make it work at too higher pressure or too lower pressure, then the host body, the body is going to suffer, and eventually it's going to die. That is the process that is happening. We need rivers for the health of our environment, so we can get good drinking water is just the most obvious one. For physical reasons, we also need it for more elusive and less quantifiable reasons. Basically, beautiful rivers are good for our souls, and they make our lives richer and happier. Going to the river is an important part of our lives, but the important thing to consider is that rivers are the lifeblood of this country. If we do them wrong, then we destroy ourselves.
Simon, thank you for that. I really understand. I really connect with what you said about going to the river can be good for the soul. I wonder if, because when you stand next to a polluted river, it can still look beautiful. I wonder if we've perhaps forgotten to worry about rivers in general in a way that we've known to worry about other things. Perhaps we don't feel it day to day in the way that we feel other types of pollution in the air or litter on the street or things. Do you think that's fair?
There's something in that. There's certainly something in that. When I was a boy, I went to a school by Clapham Junction, but it had ideas well above its station, and it had a boathouse near Barnes Bridge, and I used to cox 8s on that river, and God, it stank. I remember the stench of that river, the impossible, that dead river that I used to sit on every Wednesday afternoon and every Saturday morning, and it was awful. Now my father lives around there, and I go there quite often when times are easier, and the river is much better. It's much better. You see herons there, you see terns there in season, showing that there is life in the river, that there is fish. It's improved. Well, lots of things are improved. The fact that it's improved doesn't mean that it's at its optimal. It doesn't mean that it's at its best. So yes, you're absolutely right. A river scene can look lovely, and below the surface, it can be nothing. It can be indeed a dying river.
Simon, thanks so much. I'm going to come now, if I can, to Mark Lloyd, who is the Chief Exec of the Rivers Trust. Mark, if you're there, can you just tell us a bit about the Rivers Trust, what it does, who you represent?
Well, the Rivers Trust is the Rivers Trusts are a movement of environmental charities. It was formed about 25 years ago. I was involved in setting up one of the first ones in London, actually, on the River Thames. So I know Barnes Bridge very well, and we used to haul shopping trolleys and all sorts of rubbish out of the river back in the early 90s. But that's really the movement has grown as a result of a sort of grassroots movement. Local people who cared so much about their river, they wanted to volunteer, look after it, and raise money, and then it's gradually become more and more professional. And we have now over 300 staff throughout England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and increasingly in Southern Ireland as well. So it's grown very, very rapidly over 25 years, and really our job is to look after rivers, make them better, raise money, bring people together, get a kind of coalition of the willing to sort rivers out. And we're kind of one of the biggest NGOs that no one's heard of. We're trying to do more to change that, but we are growing very, very rapidly as an organisation and as a network of organisations.
Now, Mark, when we saw the slides at the beginning, although I did notice frustratingly a couple of the labels had dropped off the graphs, the picture that they painted was a pretty bleak picture. You know, all of the rivers in this country sort of essentially unsafe, poisoned, essentially. What is going? First of all, is that data representative? Is it accurate? Is it fair? And secondly, what is going wrong?
It's a very complex picture because you will often hear stories, statements from people like the Environment Agency saying, our rivers have never been cleaner since the Industrial Revolution, and there are lots of success stories out there, particularly in urban areas. We had the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which was something that came out of something called the European Union. Remember that? And that had a real impact on urban rivers, and we were actually, the government was infracted several times by the EU for failing to implement it, but has done a better job. And in fact, London is about to get much cleaner due to a huge super sewer, which is going to take sewage down the river. So there are lots of success stories out there, but the general picture is pretty gloomy, actually. 86% of our rivers are failing to meet good ecological status as defined by the Water Framework Directive, which is another EU directive, which is less exacting and easier to wriggle out of than the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. And that number has gone down. So we were achieving 21% of our rivers at good ecological status. Now it's only 14%. So we're going backwards in terms of good ecological status. And things are even worse with chemicals. So we've only just started monitoring this properly, but we've found that no rivers in the UK, well, in England and Wales, are meeting the chemical standards. So this is just residual chemicals in the system, which many of which take ages to break down, things like polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. So that's pretty gloomy. Half of aquatic species are in decline. A third are at risk of extinction. We've seen salmon numbers have just, fallen through the floor. The eel, the European eel, which used to proliferate in our rivers, they're down by about 95% across the whole of Europe. So things are really bad. In terms of the causes, physical modification is actually the biggest cause. So all of our rivers have weirs in them. I mean, thousands and thousands of weirs, probably about 40,000 weirs across the UK.
Okay.
And those are barriers to fish migration, and they also break the natural functioning of rivers. The next biggest cause is diffuse rural pollution, which you had as agriculture, but is broader than that, but principally agriculture. And the intensification of agriculture over the last 50 years, and particularly, in fact, the last 30 years, has caused massive problems for rivers, loosening the soil, pesticides, fertilizers, slurry, a shift from farmyard manure to slurry, intensification of chickens, a whole plethora of issues that have led to more pollution in rivers. Point source pollution which is what comes out of a pipe. Diffuse is sort of general, is actually getting better, mainly because of industrial processes being regulated quite well and sewage treatment being generally improved, but has a long way to go. And then there are issues with low flow. So many of our rivers don't flow any longer for parts of the time. We have these dry years and they stop flowing altogether, which is obviously very bad for fish when there's no water in the river. And also unknown is a major reason. So we don't know nearly enough about our rivers, and we need far more data in order to find out what's causing the problems, where they are, how bad they are.
Thank you, Mark. I would say on the point of the agriculture one, which you called something different,
diffuse agricultural, diffuse rural pollution, yeah.
Diffuse rural pollution. We did invite representatives from the National Farmers Union and a couple of other organisations on this evening because we wanted to talk to them about it to see what their perspective was on that. But they weren't able to come in the end. I just wanted to sort of flag that because agriculture is obviously a really big part of this overall picture, and it would seem to me, and we'll come in a second to another of our sort of invited experts, Matt, who represents a water company, and there are a few big chunks of sort of people in the mix. There's the sort of regulator bodies, the Environment Agency, and then the new one, which we'll come on to talk about in a bit. There's obviously the water companies themselves. There's ordinary people, me, you, where we put our rubbish and those sorts of things. And then sort of in general industry. Now, the first thing you described about weirs, forgive me, if this is obvious to everybody else, I'm sorry, but what's that to do with? The building of a weir, I know what a weir is, but why do you build one? Why do you put one in?
Often to maintain a constant water level so that water can be taken off for it used to, many water mills were powered that way, so you'd have a mill leak going off, or there's an abstraction point for drinking water,
okay.
or for navigation. So it holds up a level of water, and then you can have a lock, and you have a sort of constant level of water above it. But very bad for fish migration, both up and downstream, and nearly all fish need to migrate up and down river in order to complete their life cycle. And it also destroys the hydrogeological function of a river, which sounds pretty boring, but it's basically gravel kind of moving down the river, steadily supplying habitat for invertebrates, which live in the gaps between the stones and where fish lay their eggs between the stones as well.
And are people still building those weirs? Are there lots of those going in now? Have they been there for long? I can see a comment from Ashley Smith that I thought, if they're from the Industrial Revolution, why are there still so many happening new ones?
Yeah, many of them are protected because they've got heritage status, which I always think is absurd. But there have been some new barriers built as a result of a sort of rush to generate hydropower, which is a whole topic in itself. But it is basically an irrelevance in terms of dealing with climate change, but would cause massive damage to our rivers by putting in lots of turbines into them. We're actually quite flat and not very wet country, despite what we think.
Doesn't feel like that.
And there isn't enough water going down our rivers to generate more than about 1% of our electricity, even if we tried really hard.
Okay, interesting. Thank you very much, Mark. A bit of a tour de force on the kind of, this is the idiot's guide, if you like, the sort of beginner entry level river pollution was excellently done there by Mark. I'm going to come to Matt then, because one of these major sort of constituents in cleaning up rivers, Matt Wilden, is the water companies. The water companies, if I do my research and I read a quick Google search and read the sort of most recently published, The Guardian did an excellent piece actually with following a freedom of information request not long ago about sewage being sort of discharged into rivers. Water companies get it in the neck is probably the way that I would most likely describe it. Why? You're a representative of a water company, Wessex Water. Why is it that water companies are perceived often for not doing enough to tackle this issue?
Thank you. Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for the invite. I'm a wild river swimmer myself. I'm very much passionate about the environment, but I'm kind of juggling representing the water company and the water industry, as well as being passionate about protecting rivers too. So do hear me out. I guess what we're seeing at the moment is a massive increase in available data that is revealing things that hitherto we didn't know about, we being society. And it's quite shocking what we're seeing in terms of the extent of overflows. If we focus on storm overflows, which I guess is the kind of the main focus of the problem. So what is coming across now is, oh gosh, these things exist, because I didn't know they existed. And now look at how often they're spilling. That's got to be really bad. And of course, there's big elements of truth there, but also we've got to remember that the continuous discharges from sewage treatment works have been happening all the time, and we've been measuring it. And there's other sources of kind of pollutants depending on what we're looking at as well. I think it's really important in the debate to say, are we talking about environmental health or are we talking about public health? As a river swimmer myself, you know, public health is important.
Yes.
But as an environmentalist, environmental health is really important. And I think we often get the stuff muddled up. When Mark was talking about the Water Framework Directive, there are about 83 parameters that need measuring, most of which are unpronounceable. And that's not measuring everything. For instance, this fleece that I'm wearing, when I wash it, hundreds of thousands of microplastics, microfibers are going to come off this. And if they go over an overflow or through a sewage works, they're going to end up in the river.
Right.
If I take some antidepressants, they're going to go through and they're going to go into the river. So pollution is a lot more than, I guess, what people would consider to be just, you know, sewage.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fire. If I wash my curtains or my sofa cover, and the surfactants or the fire retardants, which are terrible chemicals, which are persistent in the environment. Those are some of the really big societal things that we're just beginning as a society to understand cause and effect. So I was really glad when you mentioned, you know, who are the main players. We are, as individuals, as just as much as these, you know, big water companies who've got a job to do. And as Mark said, it's complicated. It's not just about public health, where there's two parameters to measure. Water Framework Directive is about good ecological health, good chemical status, and hundreds of unpronounceable chemicals. And the reason, as Mark pointed out, that they're failing is we've just started measuring them.
Right.
And so we're opening up big issues where the solutions are complex, because they are societal problems where the problems are ubiquitous in the environment, and we only just begin to understand how bad they are. So I'm opening up lots of questions here rather than answering anything.
I want to do a follow-up. It's really interesting and useful to get the context, Matt. And I absolutely accept that this is a big problem, and what ends up in the river is not as simple as what comes out from the sewage overflow pipe. I totally understand that, and that it's coming from everywhere, and that we're all individually responsible. I absolutely accept that point. What my question is, when I hear a sort of defense or an explanation, which is this is a big problem, but it's actually very complicated, there's a sort of part of me that wonders, yeah, but I accept it's complicated, but there are also big and very specific things that water companies, for example, can and should do, and are they doing them? I don't like the complexity defense to distract from things that can be fixed. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, there are still loads of improvements that water companies can do, without doubt. You know, as Mark said, again, huge investment has been done under the driver of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, under the driver of the Water Framework Directive. And I guess if you look at the kind of percentage of contribution now from water companies, it is, you know, in the kind of 30% of reasons for not achieving good ecological status, compared to agriculture and other sources, which is filling the other 70%. So yes, water companies have got a long way to go. Storm overflows are becoming far more we're becoming far more knowledgeable about their operation, but not about their impact. So, you know, if you look at the stats, they say that storm overflows contribute between 3 and 7% of the reasons for not achieving good ecological status. Now, that's either under measurement, because we're not measuring it, or actually it's a very small percentage of the bigger problem. It's not, I'm not saying it's not a problem, but I'm saying is we are actually lacking a huge amount of data that we need in order to drive doing the right thing. And tackling point sources is going to be easier than tackling diffuse problems, without doubt. So I think that's going to be the obvious first steps, will be to, you know, tackling where it's kind of pipe discharge rather than just seeping into the river from millions of different sources.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matt. Good answers, and I will come back to you probably as we sort of get into some of the complexities of this. I'm going to bring in a couple of people from the chat before I go back to Karen and the River Wharf. I wonder if Mark Sutcliffe is there. Mark, I spied a comment that you made earlier on. Are you there, Mark?
Yeah.
Hiya.
Hiya.
You talked about the new ELMS. What is it?
So that's the Environmental Land Management Scheme. It's currently being rolled out to replace kind of basic farm payments. And it means that farmers are going to have to farm more environmentally to get the same level of payments that they would have got for just kind of owning land. And this is designed to drive perhaps more sustainable farming. I just wonder to what extent this new mechanism could be used to disincentivize the sort of farming methods such as intensive ploughing and high input agriculture that means a lot of soil and silt and chemicals end up in our rivers.
This kind of comes down to stick and carrot, the incentive disincentive thing, which would seem to me to be a big part of this conversation. Where's the ELMS come from? Who's designed that? Does it originate with the UK government, from DEFRA? Where's it from? Do you know?
Yeah, it's a government initiative. It flowed from Michael Gove's time at Environment, and it's had a kind of cautiously positive welcome because it probably, well, ostensibly could be better than CAP for the environment, but it's complex, it's still in flux, and it's probably vulnerable to lobbying from corporate interests to perhaps water it down.
Interesting. Mark Lloyd, what do you think of the ELMS?
It's a huge opportunity. It's about £3 billion of subsidy goes to agriculture every year. We are currently subsidising farmers to grow things like maize, twice, in fact. So we give a subsidy for owning the land, and we also provide very generous feed-in tariffs to put maize and farm slurry into anaerobic digesters. So we're paying public money twice to grow maize, which is a crop which is incredibly damaging, leads to compacted fields, slurry being spread on the fields, runs off into rivers, causes flooding and pollution. So that's a really bad use of public money. So ELM is intended to correct that, and the chances are it will go terribly wrong because it's being administered by the Rural Payments Agency and being set up by DEFRA, and so that combination is pretty worrying. But it is a huge opportunity, and if you could bring together that £3 billion of money and spend it in ways which were designed to restore and protect catchments, and combine that with the £1 billion worth of money which the water companies invest every year in the water industry natural environment programme, you would have two very big sources of funding. And if you applied those intelligently based on really good data, with clear governance and someone in charge of that saying what should happen based on feedback from local community groups and people who really know their rivers and their river catchments, you could make a huge difference. And there are lots of other big sources of money out there. There's flood defence money, which we typically spend on building huge concrete defences, which then need to be built higher and higher as climate change increases. And if we could spend that a lot more on natural flood management measures and planting trees in the right places and using all the carbon offset funds and the biodiversity net gain funds, which are going to be coming in, you could build a package of several £1 billion, which, if spent in concert rather than separately, could transform our landscape and lock up loads of carbon and reduce massively pollution and reduce flooding and restore security of water supply, because too much of our water is rushing out off the fields, down the rivers, causing flooding and out to sea, rather than soaking into the aquifers and recharging them.
The way that you describe that solution, Mark, if we did this and we combined this funding with this funding and we worked with local groups and executed in this way with an independent governance structure and so on, that seems like a prescription for progress. But the tone of voice that you deliver it makes it seem like, but that's not going to happen. And my question is, why not?
Well, we don't have the governance structures to do that at the moment. So we have catchment partnerships around the country, which are woefully underfunded. They get £15,000 a year to bring together all the different players in a local catchment. There are 105 of them in England. It was a brilliant move setting them up. It was in fact in response to a judicial review that I brought against the government with my former hat. That was a great thing to do, but they've been underfunded ever since. So they need double, treble the money every year. That's the bottom-up movement, but you need someone at a kind of meta catchment, like the size of the Thames, to direct that strategic cash into the right places. And that isn't there. A lot of people are calling for it. Economists like Dieter Helm are calling for it. We're calling for it.
Yeah.
But at the moment, no one is in charge, and it's chaos. And there are multiple plans, all of which overlap, conflict. None of them are sort of joined up.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to come back to Simon before we do what my boss, James Harding, calls a handbrake turn and change flavour for a little bit of the conversation. Simon, I could get very blue listening to Mark talking about the sort of bureaucratic engine on which we depend to make these sort of big policy shifts that can really make a difference to rivers. But part of Mark's prescription, well, first of all, I'm interested to know if you agree with Mark's kind of prescription for how to make progress on this. And secondly, part of his prescription did involve working with local community groups, and Matt's description of an individual's behaviour can make a big difference. Is that your sense too? Well,
yeah, this is a conflict, and I'm very conflicted about it. I think a lot of us will feel that way. Hope and despair are always warring in anybody who's involved in conservation, anybody who loves nature. You look out at something beautiful, as I have here, a beautiful flood meadow and marshland fed by the nearby river, the River Chet, which is a gorgeous river in the lakes. But then you start talking about the politics and who's in charge and who the vested interest is and who the money goes to. And you say, you know, there's no point in fighting this. It's just too ghastly, or if you prefer to hide behind that, it's just too complicated.
Yeah.
But let's look at fracking. I did a piece for Tortoise, a big three-parter on fracking, looking at how it worked. I went to a site and I talked to the people there. I talked to the people there who were doing the civilized protest at local level, local parish council type level. And I spoke to the people on the gates who were doing the uncivilized process, all equally necessary parts of it. Fracking has been stopped.
Yeah.
Why not? Because people said, no, 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 we can't do that. That's awful. That is awful. We can't do that. Well, that's what democracy is. It's not about checks and balances and one man, one vote and all that. It's about people saying, no, we can't do this. That's absolutely wrong. Well, it happened with fracking. It's happening with the environment in which we live in is being destroyed. And we all live in the environment, a fact that politicians and those who meld opinions keep forgetting. Well, over the course of this, the pandemic, lots and lots of people have been turning to nature for comfort, for something to do. And I said, I never realized how wonderful it was, how wonderful it was. It's been in front of me all along. Well, if all these people can say, well, yes, I will concentrate a little bit more, I will do a little bit more. And if they look at such things like the state of our rivers and say, you know, how many of them are in a good state? What is that? Is that naught? Is that naught? When people say, well, we can't live like this, we can't run our country like this, that's crazy.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon. I couldn't agree more. I'm going to come now, if I can, to Karen. I feel like I've trailed you 3 times, Karen Shackleton, in Ilkley, because you are somebody who has, I don't know if you categorize yourself as a civilized or an uncivilized protest person, but you have been part of a really important campaign that has fairly recently had a sort of milestone success. I know it's only the beginning of fixing the problem, but tell us a bit about the Clean River campaign in Ilkley and how you got involved and what you've been campaigning for.
Okay, well, a local fisherman came to me saying, instead of catching fish on his line, he's catching condoms, flushable wipe, the so-called flushable wipes, sanitary towels, but no fish. And he'd gone to find out why this was happening. And he discovered that there was, every time it rained in Ilkley, there was raw sewage entering the river system from the Ilkley sewage treatment works. And he'd spent over a year or two documenting it, talking to Yorkshire Water, talking to the Environment Agency to get them to sort it out. And he just wasn't getting anywhere. So I'm vice president of the Wharfdale Naturalist Society, and he approached me, and so I went down and had a look, and it was horrendous. The river was so low, you could see it was spilling across the gravel where families were paddling and playing in the rivers, and you could see all the sanitary products, condoms, wet wipes, all scattered across the river, all across the pebble beach and the riverbed. And I was absolutely horrified. So I went to the Wharfdale Naturalist Society committee meeting, and I said to them, this is horrendous. We really need to do something about this. And they came back and they said, well, A, we're not a campaign group, and B, it's legal and it's allowed by the Environment Agency. So what can we do about it? And I remember thinking to myself, well, it might be legal, but it's wrong. This shouldn't be happening. It's, 2020, this can't be going on in our beautiful river where I've grown up as a child, swinging in the river and playing and splashing around. I was absolutely horrified. So luckily, I knew a very good guy called Professor Batterby, who was a water ecologist, and Becky Malby, who saved the Ilkley Lido from closing down. So I know she had the contacts and she'd got campaign experience, and she's quite feisty as well. And we all got together and we formed a group called the Ilkley Clean River Group. And we pulled in the Yorkshire Water and the Environment Agency into a town meeting to hold them to account. And the Environment Agency just says, well, they're acting within the terms of the permit and it's having no ecological impact on the river. Well, when I see sanitary towels and condoms and wet wipes flowing down my river, I took offence at that. So they said it's having no ecological impact on the river. There's nothing we can do. We said, well, the permit that you allow Yorkshire Water to discharge the raw sewage into the river is set so low because it's only supposed to happen under the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. Periods of extreme prolonged rainfall conditions. We says it's happening here after 20 minutes of everyday rain.
Which in Ilkley is every day.
But we're in Yorkshire. It rains in Yorkshire, believe me. And so we said, well, the permit's set to so low. They says, well, Yorkshire Water are not breaching the terms of the permit. So we've no grounds to increase the permit. And we said, well, it's set that low. They're never going to breach the permit. So we were going round in circles there. And the only way that we could get action was then to apply for bathing water designation. And there's no other river in the UK with bathing water status. And this means that the water quality has to reach a certain standard, which is 900 coliform units per milliliter of water. And to achieve that, that would mean that Yorkshire Water would have to invest in upgrading sewage treatment works upstream at Addingham and also at Ilkley to reach those standards.
Can I just interrupt a sec? I just want to ask a couple of questions. So when you first twigged that this was a problem, that was only last year, is that right?
No, we've been going over 2 years now.
Okay, fine. So a couple of years ago, when you first twigged and you got together with Becky and the professor that you mentioned, Batterby, did you say? And you kind of got yourselves together, and then you realised you were going to have to apply for bathing water status. And who do you apply to?
You apply to DEFRA.
You apply to DEFRA, and there's a form, is there, that you can fill in or something that says, I want to have bathing water status. You have to prove that people want to swim in the river. Like, what do you have to say to ask for it?
Ilkley is quite a tourist attraction. We've got the famous Ilkley Moors on one side. We're on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales National Park. We're at the end of the train line from Leeds and Bradford. So a lot of people and families come and play in the river. And what we had to do with DEFRA was to prove that people are coming and playing in the river and swimming in the river and using that. So we had to count twice a week throughout the summer people who were swimming, playing and paddling in the river. And we also had to get permission from the landowner, which was Bradford Council, to apply. And on some days we had up to 1,700 people playing in the river, which was potentially contaminated with sewage.
So I'm conscious of time, Karen. I love the story, but maybe we should have a separate thinking, just me and you, about the River Wharf. Might just be an audience of two. But essentially, you heard back. You got the bathing water status. It was awarded to you not that long ago. Was it in the summer this year?
That was at Christmas time. Yeah, you could have knocked us over with a feather.
And essentially, what that means is that now Yorkshire Water have to hit that cleaner number. They have to measure it, do they, and report it to somebody so that they're sort of on the hook for sorting it out?
What happens is the Environment Agency will come and test the water regularly throughout the bathing water season to assess the quality of the river and see if it's fit for swimming and hits that 900 targets. And if it isn't, they have to put signage up to warn people that the river is not fit to swim in or is. Brilliant.
Well, I think it's fantastic, and I'd love to know how in a year's time, how many days the flag has to go up to say river not clean, don't get in. It'd be fascinating to know how quickly they can kind of make back that time. Thanks so much, Karen, for telling the story. It just goes to show that if you lean into it properly, you can make a difference, at least in your little river. I like how you call it my river. I feel like it's mine, but we'll share it. Thanks, Karen. I'm going to go, if I now can now to Gwyl Wren. I hope I've said your name right, Gwyl, because you've been active in the chat and have a couple of observations to make. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes. Hello, everybody.
Hiya.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, what particularly did you want to talk about? The phosphate problem on the levels, or?
Yeah, I think the phosphate thing caught my eye for sure.
Yeah, well, essentially, I'm a councillor in Somerset, and our council received a letter from Natural England back last August, which essentially said that the phosphate levels in the streams and the rivers that were feeding the Ramsar site, which is the Somerset levels, and I'll come back to that in a moment, were above permitted levels, and therefore any future development, this is housing development, in some types of industrial development, also agricultural development, would have to have a habitats assessment before it could be passed to make sure that it was not increasing the phosphate load on the water.
Right.
Now, Mr. Wielden presumably will know about this, because one of the issues is the Wessex Water's sewage treatment works, which are not stripping out the phosphates, and I believe there are plans to do that, but as has been said elsewhere, quite a lot of the phosphates come from agricultural diffuse pollution as well. So it's a big problem, and there's an awful lot of phosphate in the system. It's continuing to pour into the system from sewage. It's a major source of it, and one of the solutions being put forward, apart from providing developers with a calculator to help work out how much phosphate their development is going to put into the system, has been to suggest buying up farmland and managing it or farming it organically without any chemicals or fertilizers in order to reduce that load. I have to say, I think that's a bit of a forlorn hope. This is not the only place this has happened. They were having problems in Dorchester about 10 years ago, which resulted in damage to Poole Harbour. There were problems on the Solent about 2 or 3 years ago, where local authorities had to deal with a nitrate problem there. And this is increasing, and it's something that not a lot of people know about. Well, as has been said, there's a huge problem with all our rivers in this country, from low flows, erosion, siltation, chemical pollution, sewage pollution. They're in a right old mess, and this is something that really doesn't get that much prominent attention. Yeah. So I'm really pleased to be here tonight.
Thanks so much. Gwyl, I'll give Matt Wielden the opportunity to come back on a couple of those, because you mentioned, I think, the sort of rivers Gwyl was talking about are rivers that are in your hood, your patch. Are you there, Matt? Hiya.
Yes. Hi, Gwyl. Yeah, very well aware of this nutrient neutrality requirement from Natural England, and he's quite right that phosphorus is a nutrient pollution, and it's interesting when people talk about pollution, depending on where they're coming from, they're thinking about different things. So the lady from Ilkley was thinking about bacteria as pollution, because that's the primary impact on public health. The councillor here was talking about nutrients as pollution. Mark and someone else has mentioned low flows being an issue, and we talked about weirs. So this conversation, the reason that we don't seem to be progressing is because there's an awful lot of different things to assess here, and I don't want to take up too much of the precious time we have to talk about this one particular issue, which is nutrient pollution, but it's the biggest cause, I think. Mark could probably correct me if I'm wrong, or this, one of the biggest causes of failing good ecological status is phosphates. But who knows that? Very few people, if you say pollution, all our rivers are polluted, who would think the pollution is due to phosphates, which is what we are urinating out every time we go to the toilet?
Matt, I know that my colleague Phoebe asked this in the chat, and I feel like it is an idiot question, but what's bad about a phosphate? So phosphate is a nutrient, like nitrogen is a nutrient. So if you put too much nutrient into a river, too much stuff will grow, and you get what's called eutrophication, and that upsets the balance of the ecosystem, and you get too many weeds and not enough. You lose the biodiversity, and it's probably the biggest problem that we focused on. But we haven't started focusing on some even bigger things. Okay.
And I mentioned my fleece earlier, and I wasn't joking. That I'm sorry to keep steering the conversation in different ways, but it just removes it it shows that the problem is far more diverse
Yes.
than a single point issue. And microplastics, plastic is the reason plastic has been such a great material is it persists. It might break into smaller pieces and then it gets more and more dangerous. So the smaller the plastic, the more dangerous to the whole ecosystem. Where do we go? Where do we tackle this issue? And it is very much a societal issue. And I'm part of the problem, and everyone on this call is part of the problem. What we've got to do is become more understanding of the problem and the consequences of things like microplastics and phosphates and unpronounceable chemicals.
Yeah.
We can easily focus on condoms and wet wipes. You've got to question why we're sticking them down the toilet in the first place, but actually they're easy to tackle compared to some of these other things that we can't pronounce.
Yeah.
And so sadly an hour won't do it justice, but it does show some of these kind of tensions and the issues we're trying to tackle piecemeal, when actually we should be thinking about it from a catchment perspective. I think Mark mentioned it earlier about how much money we spend in catchments on flooding issues, on farming issues, on water quality issues, and actually I think one of the ways forward is to look at things on a geospatial catchment level and say, how do we resolve those as a society in that catchment? And it could be that food prices are too low and we're skinning the farmers and they're not able to do their job properly, or water bills are too low and we're not valuing surface water separation from foul water. I mean, who came up with the idea of combining clean water and dirty water and putting them together into a single pipe? Well, we've been doing it for 200 years.
Yeah.
So if you want to unwind it, it's going to take many years to unwind. It was a bad idea. We've just realized it's a bad idea now.
Yeah.
And so clearly we want to keep the two apart. And everyone has a part to play in that, because you don't pay for that service, or you pay a tiny amount. No one values surface water drainage. No one measures it. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. We don't measure it. We don't measure it. We don't value draining our roofs of all the rain that lands on them.
Yeah.
And so we just put it together and chuck it in the through the sewage works or on the overflow. And it's not valued. We don't put value to things that are free.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. There is a lot to unpack for sure. I know we're just kind of trying to get our heads around at the beginning. This quite often happens in a thinking like this. We haven't really looked at something before. It takes us a while to tease out what is going to be helpful and useful for us as a newsroom journalistically to go looking at, to try and help people to get their heads around it. Sometimes when we do things like Matt's just been describing, we need to think bigger, we need to go broader. That probably is the right answer, but it's quite hard for us as a newsroom to sort of pick away at something like that. I sort of feel like we're helping people to understand things in a way that they can get their heads around and contextualize and make them feel motivated and exercised to care about and notice. It is often more where we have to focus our sort of journalistic energies. And I'd be interested to know what people think those sorts of things, those starting points might be in this regard. I'm going to make sure I have time to talk to Ashley Smith, because I know you're in the audience at the moment. Ashley, you've been very active in the chat, and you are a representative of the campaign group for the Windrush River, Oxfordshire, right?
That's it, yes.
Hi, Ashley.
Hi.
What's your take on all of this? You're very active in the space, you know loads about it. What are you trying to achieve with your campaign?
Yeah, and I appreciate from the chat that this is new stuff to a lot of people, and they won't believe it. They won't believe how bad this is, because we didn't. It's been quite an enlightening time. So we set up because we live in the Windrush catchment. There isn't much confusing about that. It's a small river. Many small rivers are suffering from sewage pollution. They haven't got the dilution to handle it. It's also very simple because we haven't got heavy industry on there. We haven't got any kind of hefty agriculture like they've maybe got on the River Wye and such places. So we focused on sewage pollution, discovering that untreated sewage is dumped into rivers legally, we were told to start with. And that was shocking enough. And we thought that periods of a few hours would be quite damaging. Then we discovered that sometimes this could go on for days. And now more recently, because of some quite sophisticated analysis that we've conducted, because one of our team is a highly skilled analyst, we've discovered that some of our sewage works are spilling untreated sewage for months on end. 3 months commonly at a sizable works at Whitney, which produced sewage fungus, which if you don't know what sewage fungus is, I suggest you look to find out. It's pretty nasty stuff which coats every surface on a river. It's kind of, yeah, it's what you imagine. And there was 1.6 kilometers of that persisted over that period, and that meant it's not just that. It's okay. You've got phosphates in there. You've got nitrates. You've got the usual stuff that you've been talking about. There's a whole array of chemicals, and if you go into any supermarket and turn a few labels over, you'll see that some of them, quite a lot of them, are labelled harmful to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. So there's a lot of a kind of insidious flow of nastiness going into our rivers, apart from that massive dose of sludge, ammonia, and the rest of it. Now, if it doesn't kill a lot of fish, you won't get much interest out of the Environment Agency. So, you know, I don't want to kind of bore you with the detail here, but what we've discovered is that sewage pollution is far longer in duration than we thought. The quantities are much greater. So much of it was hidden. It was known about by the industry. They've been monitoring it for years, but now they've had to release the event duration monitoring information, which showed huge numbers, shocking numbers, far worse than we thought. But our own analysis has also shown more of those, and that's analysis using artificial intelligence. There was a paper released on an academic paper on that recently.
Yeah. Ashley, can I ask you, so you've established and measured carefully the extent and the severity of the sewage pollution in particular in the Windrush River that you're worried about. So your campaign, who are you asking to do what? What is the sort of technique of leverage that you're trying? Is it just about raising public awareness of how bad it is and hoping that that has a sort of onward impact? What are you actually doing to try and get someone to care and change this?
Okay, so we're not kind of insular and just worrying about the Windrush. We share a lot of information across the country. The Windrush is one river of many. And in fact, you try and find a river that's not hit in this way, and you'll be doing quite well. In fact, we'd like to find one that's clean from one end to another. So we're very disappointed by the Environment Agency. Unfortunately, that's very much part of the problem. The policy of only prosecuting the top few offences means that you'll get typically the odd case coming to court after approximately 4 years, maybe. And the fines were originally derisory. They're now up into the millions, but they're still not enough to get the attention of the water industry. It's still cheaper to remain polluting in a huge industrial scale than it is to fix the problems that are causing that pollution. So we've gone around the Environment Agency direct to the water industry, which I have to say is much more responsive, although it's a monopoly, which is part of the problem. So we can't say to Thames Water, hey, we just don't have, we're paying for our sewage to be treated, you're putting it straight in the river, you're actually adding tankers of it, of people who've emptied their septic tanks while it's overflowing. That's pretty much going straight into the river. We're going to go to Wessex Water, who are doing a nice job. Okay, you can't do that. It's a monopoly. So we go to the industry, and we make some progress. But a lot of it is about public opinion, because as the World Wildlife Fund said back in 2017, when they released an excellent report called Flushed Away, talking about what people commonly called CSOs then, the industry now has restricted the language around that, overflows. They said that when people found out about this, they were shocked and appalled. But public concern was very high, but public awareness was very low. And I get the feeling it's still very low.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I think it probably is. I'm just very conscious of time. I've got 1,000 more questions actually, but I'd like to just come quickly back, if I can, to Mark. We have mentioned, actually just talking about the Environment Agency, we know their funding has been cut by half, and just before we started, I sort of asked you, do you think the Environment Agency have the resources and the wherewithal they need? And I think you said basically no. My question to you is about this new regulator, the Office for Environmental Protection, which is being set up, comes into force this year, I think. Who is that? what's it doing? Is it going to work? Is it going to help? Is that going to be a game changer or not?
Well, in the past, the government was held to account for implementing the Water Framework Directive and other European directives by the European Union. And that was very useful. And NGOs like us used to complain about the government failing to implement those directives, and they could be infracted and face sanctions by the European Union. So that was very useful. So the Office of Environmental, sorry, I can't even say it, OEP, is intended to hold the government to account and make sure that it does the things which it says it was going to do in law. And there are a lot of worrying signs that it is not going to have the teeth that it needs and the independence. The chair is being appointed by the Secretary of State. And it just, there's a real sign, and it should be in place by now, and it hasn't even been set up. There's a sort of interim arrangement. So it hasn't started well. We have put a lot of pressure on with other NGOs to try and make it more teethy. But I think citizens can actually play a huge role in all of this. And it is a topic that is getting up the agenda. We had lots of MPs supported Philip Dunn's sewage bill, which is a private member's bill, but I mean, it got about 140 MPs backing it. And it has actually led to the government saying that it's going to take this seriously and it is going to legislate on it. We're trying to force that through to make sure that ash's problem and lots of other problems like that are solved around the country. But it is a wicked problem, as Matt said. In fact, all of these are wicked problems. They're the wickedest of all wicked problems with rivers. But the sewage issue is something that isn't just about water companies. It is about changing the whole way that surface water is managed in society and the way that we behave, the way that we flush things down the toilet and cause massive blockages. So fats and sanitary products and nappies and clothing and things. Amazing what people flush down toilets and block up the pipes, which causes them to overflow. But we also need to redesign our entire urban landscape in order to divert fresh water into rivers rather than into sewers.
Thank you very much, Mark. We have hit 7:30, and sometimes, I mean, I know I only subbed in at the last minute, so I came to this sort of less well prepared than I would normally for thinking. But sometimes you do thinking where you really, really learn loads, and this has been one of those. And I can see from the people in the chat as well that there's a lot we don't know and don't understand about rivers. I don't feel comfortable with just saying it's terrible and it's really hard to fix it. I feel there always has to be a way to fix it, and whether it's by going down the Karen route and just getting a merry band of campaigners together and addressing the immediate problem that you can see, or whether it's really properly leaning in to the sort of bureaucratic infrastructure and understanding the regulation and finding a way to sort of challenge and lobby. Somewhere in amongst that there must be a way, and we will take this away as a newsroom, and perhaps with Simon's help, we will think about ways that we can report out stories, big ones or small ones, that will help people to understand and emotionally connect with this as an issue that I think doesn't get its fair share of this sort of ecological, environmental sustainability airtime. It's been completely fascinating, and a really big thank you to Simon, to Mark, to Matt, to Karen, to Ashley who came on, and to everybody who has contributed, to Gwyl who was great. I've learnt loads. You can watch it back, you can share it widely with your networks if you want to, but thank you for being here with us this evening. Have a lovely rest of the evening and a nice dinner, which I should be having myself. Goodbye.